Part 1. How a burst tire started a billion-dollar catastrophe. It started on the morning of July 23, 2018, on Highway 299 in Northern California. A car hauling a heavy trailer was moving down a stretch of hot, dry road. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming, just another summer morning in the Central Valley. Then a tire blew. The driver couldn't stop in time. The wheel's metal rim hit the asphalt and began grinding against it at high speed. The friction was intense enough to throw sparks in every direction, and those sparks landed in grass along the roadside that hadn't seen rain in weeks. The fire started instantly. What made that moment so catastrophic wasn't bad luck. It was the conditions nature had spent days building. The humidity in the region had dropped to 5%. 5. The temperature was above 45 degrees Celsius. A strong, gusty wind was already moving through the area, and the moment those sparks caught the grass, the wind drove the flames straight into a dense wall of dry forest. The fire had a name within hours, the Carr Fire. At first, it looked like a serious but manageable wildfire, the kind California deals with every summer. Fire trucks arrived quickly, but the fire wasn't interested in being managed. It jumped over wide defensive ditches, it crossed rivers, it moved faster than the equipment sent to stop it. In the town of Redding, residents could see black smoke rising on the horizon. Most weren't alarmed. This is California. They'd seen fires before. What they hadn't seen, what no one alive had ever seen on this scale, was what that fire was about to become.
Part 2, the birth of the fire tornado. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what a fire tornado actually is, because this wasn't a wildfire that got out of control. It was a wildfire that turned into something else entirely. When a large area of forest burns, it releases a tremendous amount of heat energy all at once. That heat supercharges the air directly above the flames, making it extremely light, sending it rocketing upward at enormous speed. To replace that rising air, cold air has to rush in from the surrounding area at ground level. Now imagine all of this happening in a narrow valley, where converging winds from different directions are forced into a tight channel. The competing air currents don't just collide, they start to spin. Physicists call the result turbulence. But in this case, with this much heat, the spinning accelerated into something far beyond turbulence. Think of water spiraling down a drain. As it spins, it draws more water into the vortex. The tighter the spiral, the faster it moves. The Carr Fire created the same effect, but with superheated air and burning gas instead of water. The vortex drew in oxygen from every direction, feeding itself, accelerating its own rotation, growing larger with every second. Within hours, the fire had stopped burning across the ground. It had organized itself into a single spinning column, and that column began to rise. Wind speeds inside the vortex reached 230 kilometers per hour. That is the equivalent of a Category 4 hurricane, except this hurricane was made of fire, rotating at the center, with temperatures inside the funnel exceeding 1400 degrees Celsius. That is hot enough to melt steel, hot enough to melt copper and gold. The column rose to 7,000 meters, higher than most commercial aircraft fly. A massive black cloud of soot and burning material blotted out the sun across much of Northern California. Scientists watching the data were stunned. Fire tornadoes had been documented before, but nothing remotely close to the scale. This was something new, something the models had never predicted and the textbooks had never described. And it was heading directly toward the city of Redding.
Part 3. The night the city burned. The fire tornado reached residential areas on the evening of July 26, 2018, just after 8 o'clock. People who were there described the same sequence. First, an unnatural silence, the kind that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up before you understood why. Then a sound unlike anything they had heard before, a deep, continuous roar, like the world itself tearing open, growing louder and louder from a direction they couldn't quite identify. Then, the wall of fire and black smoke appeared on the horizon, moving faster than seemed possible. The vortex began lifting objects that fire has no business lifting. Cars were pulled into the air like cardboard boxes. Ancient trees, a century of growth, roots dug deep into the earth, were ripped from the ground and launched as burning projectiles. Entire streets were stripped clean within minutes. Houses that had stood for decades were reduced to gray dust in seconds, not because they caught fire and burned gradually, but because the air pressure inside the vortex physically tore them apart before the flames even reached the walls. The temperature inside the funnel melted asphalt. It boiled it, turned it to bubbling liquid. Alloy wheels on cars parked along the street softened and deformed. Glass windows in office buildings ran like water. People dropped everything and ran for the river, the one thing in the area the fire couldn't consume. Firefighters trying to reach trapped residents found their heavy trucks, 10-ton vehicles, flipped on their sides by the wind. By the time the fire tornado moved through and finally weakened, 1,108 residential buildings had been completely erased. Not burned, erased. The areas where neighborhoods had stood now looked, as survivors described it, like the surface of the moon. Smooth gray dust, no walls, no roofs, no furniture, not even rubble, just ash.
Part 4. The Highway Trap. While the city was burning, hundreds of people made the same decision at the same time. Get in the car and drive north on the highway. It was the only road out. Nobody knew that the fire tornado had crossed the ridge and was moving toward that same highway. What happened next unfolded in seconds. The sky above the highway went from orange to complete darkness. Not the darkness of night, but the impenetrable black of total smoke. Visibility dropped to zero. Cars began colliding at speed, accordion crushing into each other, forming a massive jam that stretched across the road. Nobody could move forward. Nobody could turn back. And the fire was closing in from both sides. The wind began overturning heavy trucks, fully loaded semi-trucks, vehicles weighing tens of thousands of kilograms, and throwing them onto the cars trapped beneath them. Inside those cars were families, parents with children on the back seats, elderly people who hadn't been able to get out sooner. The temperature inside the vehicles climbed with every minute, burning through oxygen. Emergency services received the distress calls, but couldn't reach the highway. The wall of fire was impenetrable. Rescuers were trapped on the outside, listening to radio transmissions from the inside. According to later estimates, approximately 250 vehicles were on that stretch of highway when the fire overtook it. The fire was traveling at 15 meters per second. Those were the longest minutes in California's modern history. When it was over, dozens of vehicles were found completely destroyed on the highway. Among those who died was firefighter Jeremy Stoke, who had been driving through the streets with a loudspeaker telling people to evacuate. His vehicle was caught in the vortex at its most intense moment. Also killed was an 80-year-old mechanic who had stayed behind to help his neighbors get their old cars running in the smoke. They became heroes, but their deaths exposed a brutal truth. The warning had come too late.
Part 5. The Forecast That Failed. In 2018, California's meteorological services were using some of the most advanced equipment in the world. State-of-the-art satellites, high-resolution radar, powerful computer models running continuous atmospheric simulations. All of it failed. The instruments detected the fire, they tracked the smoke plume accurately, but they were not designed to recognize the specific atmospheric signature of a fire tornado forming inside a wildfire. The rotation of the air column, the critical warning sign, was invisible to the existing detection systems until the vortex had already fully developed. The scientific models at the time held that fire whirlwinds of this magnitude simply did not occur outside of extremely rare laboratory conditions. No model predicted that a wildfire could generate a spinning column 7,000 meters tall with internal wind speeds matching a Category 4 hurricane. It was considered, in the technical language of disaster science, a black swan, an event so far outside the range of prior experience that the systems built to detect danger weren't even looking for it. When the evacuation alerts finally went out to residents, many received them at the exact moment flames were already reaching their homes. The total cost of the Carr Fire, more than $1.6 billion in damage. Approximately 90,000 people were in the affected region at the disastrous peak. The fire burned through 920 square kilometers. And the scientific community had to confront an uncomfortable admission. Everything they thought they knew about the limits of wildfire behavior had been wrong.
Part 6. What changed after Redding? The Carr Fire didn't just destroy a city. It permanently changed how the world thinks about fire.
In the months and years that followed, fire services across the United States began installing a new generation of laser sensors in and around forested areas, instruments capable of detecting the earliest signs of air rotation above a fire, in the first seconds before a vortex can develop. New radar algorithms were designed specifically to identify the atmospheric preconditions for fire tornado formation. Engineers began training artificial intelligence systems on the data from Reading, teaching them to recognize the signatures that human analysts in existing models had missed. Building codes were rewritten. The regulations that govern the construction of bridges, pylons, and road infrastructure, standards that had held for decades, were overhauled to account for the torsional forces generated by fire vortices. Post-disaster inspections had revealed steel bridge railings ripped clean off their supports, massive electricity pylons bent and twisted like wire, concrete foundations cracked. The engineers who reviewed the footage from Reading calculated that wind speeds at certain points within the vortex must have briefly exceeded the speed of sound. New fire-resistant construction materials became mandatory in high-risk zones across California. Emergency evacuation protocols were redesigned, with longer lead times and more conservative trigger thresholds. But the deeper warning from Reading goes beyond infrastructure. In the years since 2018, fire tornadoes have been recorded in Australia, Canada, Brazil, and Siberia, regions where such events were previously unheard of. Scientists studying global fire behavior now speak openly about a new era of extreme fire, driven by a hotter, drier climate that is expanding the conditions under which these monsters can form. The fundamental problem is straightforward and frightening. When a fire tornado reaches full height, conventional firefighting becomes useless. Water dropped from aircraft evaporates before it gets anywhere near the ground. Nothing penetrates the vortex. The only tool that works is time, enough warning early enough to get people away before the fire arrives. Reading showed the world what happens when that time runs out. A blown tire on a California highway, a spark in dry grass, a wind that moved at the wrong angle through a narrow valley. That chain of accidents in the conditions that existed on July 23, 2018, was enough to generate a fire tornado that bent steel, melted asphalt, erased over 1,000 homes, and created a death trap on a busy highway in the middle of a city. The Carr Fire was the first officially documented fire tornado of its scale in recorded history. The scientists who studied it afterwards described it as a turning point, not just for fire science, but for how humanity understands the relationship between climate, land, and the limits of the systems built to protect people. The steel and concrete that modern civilization builds its world from, the infrastructure designed to outlast storms, earthquakes, floods, turned out to be no match for superheated air spinning fast enough to crack its own sonic barrier. Two people became national heroes in those hours. Jeremy Stoke, driving through burning streets with a loudspeaker until the fire took him. An 80-year-old man who stayed to help his neighbors start their cars and never made it out. They did what people do when systems fail. They tried to fill the gap with themselves. The forests of the world are drier than they have been in generations. The climate is hotter. The conditions that turn a wildfire into something else entirely are becoming more common, not less. This won't be the last one. Which part of this disaster hit you hardest? The physics of the fire tornado, the highway trap, or the forecast failure? Tell us in the comments below. And if you want more stories that go deep into the events that changed the world, subscribe. There is a lot more still to come.